Jason and Mark had been inseparable since the third grade. Two boys who had grown up sharing secrets, scraped knees, and endless summer adventures in their small American town. Their families knew them as the dynamic duo, and for most of their lives it had seemed impossible to imagine one without the other. Jason was the charming, quick-witted one, the kind of person who could light up a room with a joke or a grin. Mark, on the other hand, was calm and careful, meticulous in everything he did, the one who planned while Jason dreamed. Together, they were unstoppable, or at least that's what everyone believed. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect friendship, cracks had begun to appear. Jason had lost his job at the local warehouse 6 months ago, and with each passing week, his frustration and envy grew. Rent was overdue, bills piled up, and the constant rejection from applications left him bitter. Mark, by contrast, had found success as a freelance consultant, steadily growing his small business and quietly saving every penny. Jason tried not to notice, tried to be happy for his friend, but envy is a quiet thing that whispers in the dark, and it had found a foothold in his mind. It was during one lazy Saturday afternoon, as they sat in Mark's living room watching reruns of old crime shows, that the news came. Mark had received an inheritance. A distant relative had left him $12,000, a sum Jason immediately realized could solve every problem he had been battling. He smiled when Mark mentioned it, congratulated him, even made a few joking remarks about splitting a small fortune for some fun. But inside, something dark stirred. $12,000 could erase debt, could buy freedom, could change his life entirely. But Mark had no idea how tempting it was to Jason. Over the next few weeks, Jason began to hatch a plan. He invited Mark to dinners, subtly brought up investment ideas, always positioning himself as trustworthy and supportive. He even pretended to encourage Mark to spend wisely, all the while plotting how he could take control of that money without losing the friend he publicly claimed to care about. At night, alone in his small apartment, Jason scribbled notes, considered every scenario. The thought of betrayal gnawed at him, yet the idea of money, of freedom from his failures, was irresistible. Mark remained blissfully unaware. He was kind-hearted and trusting, the kind of friend who would give you his last dollar if he thought it would help. He joked with Jason about taking a weekend trip to the cabin he had inherited from his grandparents, saying it would be a chance to get away from the town for a while. Jason's heart raced at the suggestion, though he carefully masked his excitement with a grin. That cabin, a secluded, rustic place miles from the nearest neighbor, was the perfect location to execute his plan. The weekend arrived. The drive to the cabin was long, the winding roads flanked by thick pines that blocked the winter sunlight. Jason kept the conversation casual, reminiscing about old times, laughing at inside jokes only the two of them understood. Mark was relaxed, unaware of the storm brewing in his friend's mind. Jason's heart pounded with every mile, his palms sweaty despite his careful control of his expression. He kept imagining the money, imagining freedom, imagining a life where he could finally breathe without the constant weight of debt. Once at the cabin, they unpacked their bags and settled in. The cozy space smelled of wood smoke and pine, a welcome escape from the town's monotony. Mark suggested they take a walk to the nearby creek, a familiar spot they had visited as boys. Jason agreed, masking his internal tension with casual enthusiasm. As they walked, the conversation turned to money, Mark's inheritance, Jason's recent struggles. "You're handling that $12,000 well, Mark. I mean, you've always been good at making it last." Mark shrugged, unaware of Jason's hidden motive. It's nothing special, just enough to take care of a few bills and maybe fix up the cabin a little. Jason nodded slowly, swallowing the bitterness that bubbled in his chest. Yeah, well, sometimes I wish I had a bit of that luck, he muttered, more to himself than to Mark. Mark glanced at him, concerned. You're doing okay, right? I mean, I know things have been rough lately. Jason forced a laugh. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, that's all. Mark smiled, oblivious. Well, I'm here for you, man, always. The words, meant to reassure, only deepened Jason's inner conflict. He had once believed in their friendship, in the bond they shared, but now envy and desperation had poisoned his thoughts. That night, after Mark had gone to bed, Jason sat by the window, staring out at the darkened woods surrounding the cabin. He thought about the inheritance, about the life he could have if he just made it his own. By morning, the plan was set. He would suggest a quick hike to a secluded part of the forest under the guise of showing Mark a hidden view he had discovered years earlier. In reality, it would be the perfect opportunity. Every detail had been rehearsed in his mind, the route, the timing, even the excuses. The excitement mingled with fear, creating a cocktail of adrenaline that kept him awake long into the night. When Mark emerged from the cabin, smiling and ready for adventure, Jason greeted him with his usual easy charm. "Ready for the view?" he asked, masking the storm of thoughts raging inside. Mark nodded, not suspecting, laughing at one of Jason's old jokes. To an outsider, they were just two friends enjoying a weekend together. But in Jason's mind, this day would mark the point of no return. As they stepped into the forest, the sun barely breaking through the trees, Jason felt his heart accelerate. He glanced at Mark, seeing the trust in his eyes, the innocence of a man who had no reason to fear the person standing beside him. And for a brief moment, a flicker of guilt passed through Jason's mind, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by the hunger for what he could gain. The cabin faded behind them, the forest growing darker, the air heavy with anticipation. Jason's plan was in motion. In the quiet, he rehearsed his words, his excuses, the story he would tell if anyone ever suspected. This was no longer about friendship, loyalty, or trust. This was about money. $12,000 could change everything, and Jason was willing to cross a line that would shatter lives. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees surrounding the cabin, casting the forest in muted shadows. Jason led the way, careful to appear relaxed, as if this hike to the hidden view was just another harmless adventure. Mark followed, chatting casually, oblivious to the storm brewing inside his friend. They reached a clearing overlooking a small, misty valley. The view was breathtaking, sunlight glinting off a winding creek, trees stretching like sentinels into the distance. Mark smiled, genuinely impressed. "Wow, I never knew this spot existed. You were right, Jason. This is amazing." Jason forced a smile, but his mind was elsewhere. $12,000. $12,000 that could erase his failures, his debt, his constant worry. The thought had consumed him for weeks, eroding every memory of trust and friendship he had left for Mark. The idyllic scene did nothing to calm him. It only sharpened the edges of his obsession. "I'm glad you like it," Jason said softly, voice trembling slightly. "It's nice to have a place to think, you know?" Mark leaned on a nearby tree, stretching. "Yeah, it's peaceful. Makes you forget all the noise in town." He laughed lightly. "Speaking of noise, I've been thinking about that $12,000. I know it's nothing huge, but Maybe we could invest it together, something small, safe? Jason froze. The words, innocent as they were, sent a jolt through him. Invest together, share the money? The thought of splitting it was unbearable. Every fiber of his being screamed, "It's mine!" "Yeah, sure," Jason replied, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "I mean, yeah, we can figure something out." He forced a grin, though inside a darker plan was already taking shape. They began to hike toward a more secluded part of the forest. Jason led the way along a narrow, rocky trail, careful to avoid suspicion. Mark talked about the town, upcoming projects, and family gatherings. He laughed freely, unaware that the man beside him, the friend he trusted most, was already thinking of ways to end his life. The moment came when the trail narrowed and the trees thickened, cutting off most of the light. Jason suggested they rest near a boulder at the edge of a small cliff. Mark agreed, leaning against the rock, stretching his legs. He had no idea that the rest stop would be the place where his fate would be sealed. Jason's mind raced. Every step he had taken in planning this moment flashed before him. The route, the secluded spot, the timing. He checked the surroundings. No hikers, no noise, no witnesses. Everything was perfect. The rational part of his brain screamed to stop, to run, to call it off. But the greed, the desperation, the obsession with the money drowned out any thought of morality. "Mark," Jason said, low, almost hesitant, I need to ask you something." Mark looked at him, curious. "What's up?" Jason hesitated, then forced the words out. I want the money, just for a little while. I promise I'll pay it back." Mark blinked, confused. "What? Jason, I can't just—" Jason's patience snapped. All the weeks of planning, the sleepless nights, the gnawing obsession with what was rightfully his erupted into sudden violence. In one swift motion, he grabbed Mark and shoved him against the rock, the two struggling briefly before Jason's hand clamped over Mark's mouth. Panic surged through Mark's eyes as he realized the betrayal in an instant. "Jason, what are you—" Mark gasped, but the words were muffled. Jason's mind went numb with adrenaline, fear, and greed. He pushed harder, a twist of the arm, a shove, and Mark stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the cliff. The scream that tore from Mark's throat echoed through the forest, horrifying in its intensity. Jason froze, his chest heaving, heart pounding as the moment stretched into eternity. Then, with a final push, Mark tumbled down the slope, disappearing from view. Jason staggered back, shaking, adrenaline coursing through every vein. He dropped to his knees, hyperventilating, staring at the spot where his best friend had fallen. For a moment, he felt a pang of something he hadn't expected. Guilt, fear, horror. That the thought of the money, of the life he could now secure, quickly eclipsed any shred of remorse. He had to act fast. Jason raced down the slope carefully, dragging Mark's body to a nearby thicket, ensuring it wouldn't be easily seen from the trail above. His hands shook as he cleaned up the scene, breaking branches to cover footprints, wiping the rocks, and even adjusting Mark's backpack to look as if he had wandered off and fallen. It was a careful choreography of deceit, executed with precision born of weeks of obsession and planning. By the time Jason returned to the cabin, the sun had climbed higher, casting brighter light through the forest. He tried to compose himself, wiping sweat from his brow, fixing his expression to one of casual concern. Mark was missing, he knew that, but he had to play the part of the worried friend. He waited, tense and silent, until the local authorities arrived, summoned by Mark's sister who had not heard from him in hours. Jason played the role perfectly, pacing, worried, feigning disbelief. "He just went for a hike. He's always loved exploring," he told the officer, voice shaky, eyes wide. "Maybe he tripped. I don't know." The officers questioned him, and Jason provided every detail he could think of, careful to remain consistent. Every lie was calculated, every pause rehearsed. Inside, he was shaking, his mind replaying the fall, the scream, the betrayal. But outside, he was the grieving friend, shocked and helpless, desperately convincing everyone of his innocence. Even the small town, close-knit and tight-lipped, began to speculate about Mark's disappearance. Rumors spread. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he fell into the creek. Maybe he had run away. Jason listened quietly, relief washing over him each time someone dismissed the idea of foul play. Yet somewhere deep inside, a creeping unease began to fester. He knew the truth could come out, that one slip could unravel everything. That night, alone in the cabin, Jason sat by the fireplace, staring into the dancing flames. The money was still unclaimed, but the weight of his actions pressed down on him heavier than any debt. He had crossed a line, betrayed the very foundation of his life, and yet the thought of freedom, of a life without financial worry, kept him from despair. Outside, the forest remained silent, indifferent to the horror that had unfolded within its depths. Inside, Jason's mind raced, spinning webs of justifications and fears. He had killed his best friend, and yet he convinced himself it was necessary. He had planned carefully, executed flawlessly, yet the fear of discovery gnawed at him. The perfect friendship ended in violence, and a small town would soon feel the shock of what greed and desperation could unleash. Jason lay awake that night, listening to the wind through the pines, knowing one thing for certain: the story was far from over. The small town had barely recovered from the shock of Mark's disappearance. The local police conducted searches along the creek, in the surrounding woods, and near the cabin, but no trace of him was found. Residents whispered behind closed doors, suspicions simmering beneath polite smiles. Jason maintained his act flawlessly, grief-stricken, anxious, desperate for answers. But as days passed, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade began to show. Detective Harris arrived on the scene, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for intuition and persistence. He was not easily fooled. From the start, Jason's behavior struck him as slightly off, not overtly suspicious, but subtle, too controlled, too calculated. Harris noted how Jason repeated phrases, mimicked grief, and sometimes avoided eye contact when asked the simplest questions. The detective filed these observations mentally, waiting for patterns to emerge. Harris began by interviewing everyone close to Mark: friends, neighbors, colleagues, even Mark's family. Each account painted a picture of a kind, careful man, deeply trusted by those around him. Nothing initially pointed to foul play. But then came the small inconsistencies, details that didn't match up. Jason said he last saw Mark at the cabin around 10 a.m., but one neighbor recalled seeing him leave the cabin much earlier. A receipt from a local store suggested Jason had bought supplies for a hike, but the timestamps contradicted his story. Jason felt the tension building. Every day, every question, every observation from the detective tightened the invisible noose around him. He tried to stay calm, but the adrenaline never left his system. He replayed the murder in his mind endlessly, obsessively checking for any mistakes he might have left behind. The thought that Harris might be closing in consumed him, gnawing at his ability to sleep or even think straight. Meanwhile, Harris found something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A torn piece of Mark's shirt had been caught on a branch near the edge of the cliff, a detail overlooked by the initial search team. It was subtle, almost insignificant, but Harris noticed it immediately. Coupled with Jason's odd behavior, it raised a red flag. Harris returned to the cabin that evening. He examined the scene with meticulous precision, photographing, measuring, and taking notes. Every footprint, every moved object, every minor detail could be a clue. Jason watched from a distance, pacing nervously, pretending to search through old boxes for any clue about Mark's whereabouts. His mind raced. He had accounted for every eventuality, or so he thought, but the detective's presence changed the landscape. Every small oversight Jason made suddenly felt enormous, threatening to expose the truth. In the following days, Harris interviewed Jason more thoroughly. Questions were direct but polite, probing for inconsistencies. Jason answered carefully, rehearsed, but under pressure, subtle slips began to appear. A hesitation here, a fumbled word there. Harris noted each one, building a mental timeline of events that slowly began to contradict Jason's story. At night, Jason's paranoia escalated. He double-checked the cabin, retraced the hike, and even examined the forest floor for clues he might have left behind. Each time he imagined Harris discovering a new piece of evidence that would unravel everything. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside made him jump. He began to suspect that even neighbors he trusted might notice something, though no one had yet. Harris's investigation picked up another lead, Mark's phone. It had last pinged near the forest, then went dark. Jason had neglected to hide the phone properly, assuming it would be found later. Harris now had a focal point, a small but critical piece of the puzzle. The detective ordered a thorough forensic sweep of Jason's home and car, looking for anything that could connect him to the missing man. Jason's mistakes were piling up. In his anxiety, he left fingerprints on a branch that Harris later photographed. He accidentally dropped a glove near the trail, which Harris collected as evidence. Each slip, minor though it seemed, tightened the detective's suspicion. Jason realized he could no longer afford to make mistakes, but the fear and adrenaline made him more careless than ever. Inside Jason's mind, a psychological battle raged. He tried to rationalize his actions, greed, desperation, the thought that Mark would never have shared the money anyway. He relived the murder endlessly, imagining the moment Mark tumbled down the cliff. Guilt and fear coexisted with relief and excitement at the prospect of keeping the $12,000. It was a chaotic, consuming storm, leaving him unable to think clearly. Harris, sensing the psychological pressure on Jason, began applying subtle tactics. He mentioned details from witness statements, forensic discoveries, and inconsistencies in conversation, watching for reactions. Jason flinched at the slightest implication, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the tension underneath. Harris didn't push too hard. He let the pressure build naturally, like water filling a cracked dam. A breakthrough came when Harris interviewed a local hiker who had seen Jason near the forest on the morning Mark disappeared. The hiker mentioned seeing Jason carrying a large backpack and moving quickly, behavior inconsistent with a friend simply looking for someone who had wandered off. Harris now had concrete evidence placing Jason in the critical area at the right time. Jason, unaware of this new lead, continued to unravel internally. Every time he thought he had control, a shadow of doubt crept in. What if someone else had seen him? What if the forensic team found something he hadn't accounted for? His nights were sleepless, his days jittery. Even casual conversations with friends became exercises in hyper-awareness, scanning for any hint that someone suspected him. One evening, Harris returned to the cabin with a forensic team. They carefully examined the furniture, the floors, the surrounding area, and even Jason's personal effects. Each minor clue added to the weight of evidence: a trace of blood hidden under the carpet, a misplaced item near the trail, and most damningly, Mark's partially torn shirt piece previously overlooked. Jason paced the cabin, heart racing, a cold sweat covering his body. He realized that the walls of his carefully constructed lie were crumbling. The detective's intuition, the forensic details, the small observations, everything pointed towards him. He had been careful, meticulous even, but nothing can account for the relentless persistence of a skilled investigator. That night, alone in the cabin, Jason sat on the floor, trembling. His mind replayed the murder, the planning, the steps he had taken to hide it. Fear and guilt battled with greed and relief. He realized he was trapped, not by the law yet, but by his own psyche. Every decision now carried weight, and every mistake could be the one that would end everything. Harris, sensing the psychological pressure on Jason, began assembling the evidence into a compelling narrative. The pieces fit together like a puzzle. The timeline, the forest evidence, witness statements, forensic traces, and Jason's behavioral inconsistencies. He knew it was only a matter of time before Jason's defenses would crumble completely. The part of Jason that planned the murder so carefully now faced the part that feared discovery more than death itself. Sleep eluded him. Paranoia became constant. Every knock on the door, every rustle of leaves outside felt like detection. The hunter had become the hunted. By the end of the third week, the investigation was tightening around Jason. Harris had all the clues he needed to make the case. He just needed the final confirmation, the moment when Jason's carefully maintained composure would break. And Jason, trapped by his own conscience and fear, had no idea how close that moment was. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The truth was closing in, and Jason's days of deception were numbered. The morning light fell softly across the small town, but the calm belied the storm that was about to break. Detective Harris had spent the night compiling every shred of evidence, lining up witness statements, forensic reports, and surveillance footage. Every detail pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Jason, the grieving best friend, was not the victim everyone thought, but the perpetrator. Jason awoke that morning with a restless tension gnawing at him. He felt the weight of the investigation closing in, the walls of his carefully constructed lie beginning to crumble. He avoided the mirror, afraid of the hollow, exhausted face staring back. Every phone call, every knock at the door, every news report about Mark's disappearance sent a jolt of panic through him. Harris arrived at the cabin mid-morning, calm but determined. He didn't rush in with accusations. Instead, he laid out the evidence, one piece at a time, letting the weight of it settle on Jason. First, the torn piece of Mark's shirt found near the cliff edge. Then, fingerprints on the rocks near the trail. Then, the subtle inconsistencies in Jason's story compared with witness statements. Harris paused, letting each revelation sink in before continuing. Jason's hands trembled, gripping the edge of the table as if it could hold him together. "I don't understand," he said, voice faltering. "I told you everything I knew. I was worried. I just wanted to help." Harris's eyes were steady, almost gentle, but they carried a weight that crushed Jason. "Jason, the evidence doesn't lie, and neither do people's memories. There's only one way this ends." Jason's mind raced, flipping through every moment, every step, every lie he had told. He replayed the hike, the clearing, the push, the moment Mark had fallen. Every justification, every rationalization he had clung to for weeks crumbled under the cold light of Harris's scrutiny. His carefully maintained composure, the act of the grieving friend, finally began to crack. The confession came quietly at first, almost reluctantly. I didn't mean to." Harris leaned in slightly, listening. "Say it. Tell me what happened." Jason swallowed, the words caught in his throat. His voice was low, broken. It got out of hand. I wanted the money. I didn't think it would. I didn't mean to. I didn't want him to die." For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Harris said nothing, allowing the weight of Jason's own conscience to fill the space. I pushed him. I didn't mean it. I swear. It was an accident. It had to be." Harris nodded, jotting notes. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need embellishment. You've told me enough." The confession shattered the calm of the town. Once the news spread, neighbors and friends were stunned. Jason, the charming, witty, beloved friend, had committed an unthinkable betrayal. The small community, close-knit and trusting, struggled to process the reality. Greed and desperation had destroyed a lifelong friendship. Meanwhile, forensic teams and search crews finally confirmed the location of Mark's body, hidden in the thicket near the cliff. The discovery corroborated Jason's confession, leaving no room for doubt. The town felt a collective gasp of horror, followed by a somber silence. As Jason was taken into custody, he did not resist. The adrenaline that had once driven him, that had fueled the murder and the lies, was gone. In its place was a hollow emptiness, a stark realization of the consequences of his actions. The $12,000, once the object of obsession and desire, now felt meaningless, a symbol of everything lost, everything destroyed. In the days that followed, the trial became a focal point of national attention. Journalists, curious neighbors, and crime enthusiasts followed every development, fascinated by the betrayal and the psychological unraveling of a man who had murdered his best friend over money. Harris testified, laying out the meticulous investigation, the forensic evidence, and the behavioral clues that led to Jason's capture. During the trial, Jason's confession was played in court, his voice trembling as he recounted the fateful hike, the push, the moment that had ended a life. The prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by greed, whose obsession had overridden morality and friendship. The defense tried to argue temporary lapse, emotional instability, desperation, but the evidence was overwhelming. The verdict was unanimous: guilty. Jason was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge delivered the sentence, the courtroom was silent. Even Jason did not react, his head bowed, finally facing the consequences he had evaded for so long. Outside, the town began the slow process of healing. Friends and neighbors mourned Mark, reflecting on the tragedy and the fragility of trust. Memorials were held at the cabin and in the town square, celebrating Mark's life and the bonds he had nurtured. The community's shock gradually gave way to reflection, an understanding that greed and desperation could lurk even in the most ordinary of lives. Jason, behind bars, had ample time to reflect on his actions. The freedom he had imagined, the relief from debt, the sense of escape, all had evaporated. He was left with nothing but memories of a friendship destroyed, a life ended, and the knowledge that a single decision had set off an irreversible chain of events. In the end, the story of Jason and Mark became a cautionary tale shared in local papers, crime documentaries, and whispered conversations, a reminder of how money, obsession, and betrayal can shatter even the strongest bonds. The town, though scarred, began to rebuild, cherishing Mark's memory while living with the lingering awareness that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers, but from those we trust most. As the sun set over the quiet town, casting long shadows across the streets, one thing remained clear. The shocking truth had rocked America, leaving a mark that would not easily fade. Jason's greed had claimed a life, and in doing so, it had exposed the fragile line between friendship and betrayal, a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed.